This is my game, Slaughter Cats, a 1 to 4 player beat-em-up platformer coming to PC and hopefully Xbox and PlayStation. I started developing my game around 4 years ago in Unity.
I'd made some basic games before in Unity at uni, and as I initially wanted the game to use 2D sprites on a 3D plane similar to most beat-em-ups, I thought Unity would be good for this.
After a few months, I've built the basic framework for lots of mechanics including lives, XP, magic, health, dealing damage, taking damage, doing attacks, a map, a blacksmith menu system where within the blacksmith menu system you could buy attacks and buy new spells and equip those, an armor system where you could equip different armor to different parts of the body which would affect how much damage you would take and other attributes, and you could also buy different weapons and equip those, and they would all have different stats which would affect damage dealt and critical hit chance and other attributes as well. I also ended up spending a lot of time on the menu system, as it can be quite complicated to get everything to work correctly with level transitions and different submenus. So this took a lot of my time just playing around with the menu system.
I eventually began experimenting more with platforming, but soon came to the realization that platforming with 2D sprites on a 3D plane was extremely difficult, as it was very difficult to judge whether the character was properly lined up with the platform. On top of this, I was very aware that the graphics weren't very good due to my poor art skills, and knew for almost all games graphics are really important, and if you have poor graphics, people would be unlikely to even look at the game. I thought about paying someone to do art for my game, but I still wasn't confident in the game, so I didn't really want to spend thousands of pounds on something which could potentially go nowhere. My game at this stage was 8 months into development, but I felt given the look of the game and issues with platforming, it wasn't going to be a success, so I slowly stopped working on the game. After a few months I had the idea to try again, but this time use 3D meshes instead of 2D sprites, as this would allow for the platforming to work and meant I didn't have to rely on my drawing skills for art. As I was using 3D this time, I decided to experiment with Unreal Engine and see whether I would be able to make something with Unreal instead, as I knew Unreal Engine generally have for much better looking games out of the box, and I feel like that is key to getting people to even look at your game. After a few weeks of experimenting with the standard 3D template in Unreal Engine 4.26, I knew I wanted to use Unreal Engine as the graphics were good straight away, and they had a lot of tools and plugins which worked straight out of the box, and also I liked the blueprints after a bit of getting used to them. I'd previously been writing the game in C# in Unity, and found it quite difficult to manage, as I'd often go back to classes I created weeks earlier, and I had to spend time going over my code again to figure out exactly what I'd done. For bug fixing in Unity as well, I found it very difficult to follow all the references through to different classes and try to debug all the issues. Whereas with blueprints in Unreal, I found it much easier to read what was going on quickly, and it was generally easy to use. I thought using a fully 3D approach worked much better for beat-em-up platformers, and I'd managed to create a very basic gameplay mechanic where you could kill enemies and they could kill you in just a few weeks. I went through many tutorials mainly on YouTube, trying to build some basic AI, and eventually managed to get something which worked in quite a basic fashion using Unreal's behaviour trees. I then began to try and make a basic cat character using the default Unreal Engine skeleton as the basis, which looked okay to start with, but I decided to attach a skeletal mesh tail and a limbic groom whiskers to give it more character. Both these components caused many issues due to physics issues, and eventually had to give up on the limbic groom whiskers as I had so many performance issues with them, and I was wasting far too much time just trying to fix problems. In the end, I decided to give up and just use static planes instead. Not quite as interesting, but saved me many headaches. I also spent a large amount of time trying to get the fur texture right for the cat characters. I experimented with many styles, trying hair cards, but the result didn't look all that good, probably due to my art skills, and also there were issues with stretching due to weight paints, which like many issues can take large amounts of time to perfect, so I just gave up with that, and after a fair bit of experimentation, came up with a texture that I was reasonably happy with. I'm still not 100% on these characters, as they do look goofy and amateurish and don't necessarily fit with the rest of the game and the environments, but in some ways I do like that. They're out of place and stand out in that respect. I will consider it more as I go through development and may either spend even more time reworking the models and textures, or I might pay someone to redo the models and textures. After getting a basic character set up, I began to work on the camera. I want to have a typical camera viewpoint used in side-scrolling beat-em-ups, whereby the background is framed and the floor of the fighting area is also viewable, while allowing a wide enough focus so that the player could see the multiple enemies around them.
I made the camera adjustable for when there are multiple players playing the game, so players can move around a bit more freely and so they can fight further apart.
I also had to build in a system to stop the players from going outside the camera view. As I'm building this game to allow up to 4 players, I didn't want players to be able to go outside the camera view and get lost. This ended up taking quite a long time, like most things with game dev. They're never as simple as they seem. The characters would still pass through walls in certain situations, so I had to build a few mechanics to act as a workaround, and this still has some issues to this day and will probably require more work in the future, but for the time being it seems good enough. I also played around with the camera switching positions during certain larger platforming sections, and after a lot of experimentation came up with a view similar to the standard view but zoomed out more, which allowed the player to see further ahead and allowed players to be in different sections if there was more than one player.
Blood is an important part of my game, as I wanted to really match the name Slaughtercats. I really like hyper-violent games like Mortal Kombat and wanted to add a lot of blood to my game in a similar way, and also like the contrast of a very violent game and cats, which are typically considered cute. I watched lots of YouTube videos, and after weeks of experimentation using cascade effects, I finally came up with something I liked. As the game progressed, I added extra Niagara effects and decals to improve the look, and I will likely iterate on the current effects further as my game progresses, as I still see room for improvement.
I then began to work on the UI so I could see the health of the character and their lives and also their magic. I decided to use a system similar to Golden Axe, where the character has a magic bar and they collect magic to fill up the bar, and then they can use this magic for a magic attack which will cause damage in a wide area. I also made the lives area different colours depending on the character chosen, and added in colour details to the character meshes and weapon effects to match this, so it makes each character a bit more distinct. I took inspiration from Castle Crashers, where the characters get large and become more powerful, and implemented a mode called Slaughter Mode, where the characters become more powerful and attacks do double damage and damage against them is halved. I did want to have some effects where somehow the character was covered in blood, almost in a rage, but didn't really find an effect which worked properly, so I ended up settling for a flame effect. After this, I began working on adding some additional enemy variety and different enemy meshes to see what worked and looked good, adding in an archer enemy and a mage enemy. I spent a long time playing with different enemies, trying to get a selection of different enemies which I thought would work well in the game. At this point, I thought it would be good to start working on the menu UI for the game, as I felt it's always good to start early on UI so you can progress with it as your game progresses. This ended up taking a long time to do, but I feel it helps when testing the game and makes the game look more professional if you have a decent menu setup. I then started working on the environment. I knew before I started that I wanted to have mostly outdoor environments, as I felt that would really allow the graphics to shine with big open environments and also suit the game style. I knew I wanted the environments to change throughout the game so as to not bore the player and provide interesting areas which would enhance the combat and platforming experience. I decided to start in some forest levels, and then later there would be canyon, sand, island, dark forest and some winter snow levels. After watching and reading many tutorials, I began working on a green forest landscape using Megascan textures as the basis for the environment. I spent a long time playing around with textures and landscaping tools, and also lighting to get something which I liked and thought looked good. Probably spent longer on lighting, to be honest, as this is really difficult to get right. After many weeks with tons of reading and tutorials and playing around with post-processing volumes, directional lights, skylights, sky spheres, atmospheric fog, sky atmospheres and exponential height fogs, I eventually came up with something which I thought was the right balance and really made the environment look good. By this point I had the basic setup for local multiplayer working, and thought that especially nowadays online multiplayer is an important feature and will really help make people want to play your game. So I decided to try and include online multiplayer, and I thought I should start early, as I was well aware that if you add online multiplayer late in development, this can cause many problems and not only mean that you have to rework tons of existing logic, but also extend the dev time massively. I managed to get basic network replication working within the editor after a few days of work, and for the time being began working on a boss. I wanted the boss to fit with the design on the existing enemies in the environment and have standard boss elements such as specific boss music, a custom boss UI at the bottom of the screen, and special attacks to make the boss unique. I mostly got this working, however even to this day the AI still isn't great and will definitely need some more work as I continue with dev. Currently you can just keep attacking the boss, and if you don't allow them time to recover, you can just kill them without them being able to attack you back. I began to work once again on the AI, as after working on the boss I was well aware there were still many bugs and issues related to the AI. As I was fixing many issues related to the stupid AI, I started to add additional enemy abilities such as blocking, dodging, and enemies having shields. After updating my project to Unreal Engine 4.27, I started working on the level complete system, which was made up of an overview of the stats during the player's run on the level and the skill points achieved as a result. Then a screen allowing the players to update their skill points, and then finally moving to a map level where the player can pick which level they move to next. The same as many platforming games such as Super Mario and Crash Bandicoot. I built a rough draft of all of these features, using them as a placeholder to iterate on as development continued. As I'd started to develop a system to store data between levels,
I then began to work on the framework and basic UI for the Blacksmith menu system, similar to what I had in Unity. Players can buy new moves, magic attacks and weapons with the gold they collect. This is still a work in progress and will require a lot more work as the game progresses.
Around this time, I once again went back to the menu systems, updating and improving them, and also reviewing the online aspects, fixing tons of additional bugs as a result of my changes over the previous months.
After having a break for a few months, I heard Unreal Engine 5 had been released. So
I began the process of trying to migrate my project into Unreal Engine 5. And this took a while because I had to wait for several plugins to be updated to Unreal Engine 5, and then having to fix quite a few issues as a result of the upgrade. After a roughly 4-month break, I started work back on Slaughter Cats. I began adding in animals to levels to bring the levels more to life, adding birds, rabbits, chickens, wolves. I figured as well as making the levels more lively, animals could add variety to enemies and have different and unique AI. This took several weeks working on the different AI, as I had to start from scratch. While I'm pleased with the results, they'll likely still need more work as development progresses. Particularly the attack animals, as they very noticeably slide to face their new direction when they turn, which of course will need to be fixed. Having upgraded to Unreal Engine 5, I decided to try and use the Unreal Engine Water again, as I'd experimented with it in Unreal Engine 4, but always had problems with it, and assumed it was just because it was still in beta. As it was no longer in beta in Unreal Engine 5, I thought it should work, and while I did manage to get it working, it did take me many weeks to get it working and looking exactly how I wanted, as it definitely can be a bit cumbersome. I was initially looking at using some plugins from the marketplace, but was happy that I managed to get the default water working, and thought the results turned out pretty damn good, and was impressed with how good the water looked in Unreal Engine, and thought it would really help with the feel of the level. I feel like Unreal can be fairly easy to do most of the standard things, but if you try to do something a bit unusual or new, there can be very little documentation or help online to help guide you in the right direction. It's often just a case of experimenting until you find something which works. I decided to go back and work on the online multiplayer aspect of the game some more, adding in a lobby system, a join system and a host system, and allowing users to configure and filter as required. While I was working on these multiplayer systems, I had the desire to add in a Deathmatch and Horde mode to add extra replayability to the game, and also allow it to be a bit more pick up and play and have this different variety of game modes, which I thought would be good. I initially thought this wouldn't take too long, as I already had the core mechanics set up for the arcade portion of the game, and figured these could be ported over to the new modes fairly easily. While that was the case to a degree, it still took a lot more work to get these modes set up, and like most things in this game at this point, they do work, but there's tons of bugs, and they'll still need a lot more work as I progress through development. By this point, I definitely knew I was going to release my game after spending so much time on it. I figured I should try and get a Steam page up and start advertising my game as soon as possible. So I figured I should set up a company and begin the process of adding my game to Steam. After a fair bit of research about setting up a company, I eventually created a company called Jilted Generation Productions, named after one of my favourite albums, and then after a few weeks managed to secure a business bank account, which meant I could set my game up on Steam under the new company. My first level was around 90% complete at this time, and I figured it would be good to have pictures from a variety of environments on Steam, to feel like they're an important component of my game. I went and started to build out the basic environments for each level, which was a lot of trial and error and experimenting with different textures and styles until I'd find something which worked. After a few weeks of building out all the levels, I started to work on weather and day and night cycles to add even more variety to the levels, as I feel like changing the environment will help maintain the player's interest. I then decided to start working on a few more bosses, getting their basic setup done, so like most things I could come back later and iterate and improve on them. I also got all my base enemy meshes set up, so when it came to really making each enemy type unique, I'd done all the groundwork. I started testing on Steam and getting hosting and joining working through Steam, and allowing players to join and invite friends through Steam. I got this working, although still a ton needs to be done for most of the online aspects, and still a million things to do. I'd always loved Ragdoll elements within games such as Flatout and GTA, and especially like the element in GTA 4 where you would Ragdoll, but then you'd get up from the Ragdoll position, and found this was also possible in Unreal Engine. So I decided to try and implement this, and after a couple of weeks of experimenting and fixing bugs, I managed to get something like how I imagined. I decided to make enemies Ragdoll as a result of kicks. I really liked this mechanic, as I felt it changed the dynamic of combat, allowing players to split enemies apart to focus on a specific one while the other enemy is knocked down in Ragdoll mode. After some multiplayer testing, it became apparent that I needed to add in accessibility options to make it easier for players if they wish, especially for when there is multiple players, as things can get quite hectic on screen. I added in outlines, player markers, landing markers, silhouettes, and the ability to customize these, and they'll probably evolve as I progress through development. After playing a multiplayer deathmatch for a while, it seemed to me like it was generally too easy to block players' attacks without any potential way of hurting the player, other than basic block damage. So I decided to add in a grapple mechanic, which is a common way in fighting games to overcome players who are blocking too much. As I like the Ragdoll so much, I decided to transition from a normal animation to a Ragdoll in the grapple attacks, making them more unique and a bit more interesting. For a while I'd had the idea to allow the player to modify the camera, either through the menu or in-game, as I thought it might be good to get closer to the character during combat, or change perspective during platforming, as it seems some people might have problems with judging depth in the default camera position. I decided to add the ability in the game to switch between two views in both normal and platforming sections. A default slightly far out view and a close view in normal gameplay, and a default zoomed out view or a higher tilted perspective in platforming sections. I may add additional views in the future as the game progresses, but for the time being I'm happy with this addition. Right now I'm working on getting the levels done, just working on building out the levels with enemies and platforming sections, and trying to make the environments challenging and interesting. I'm sure I've missed a lot, but that covers most of the main stuff. That's pretty much been my journey up until this point. Thanks for listening.